Alright, so I'm going to talk about the direct and indirect pathway of the basal ganglia. I'm going to try and simplify it as much as I can. Let's suppose this is the cortex. Now, I'm only going to make one half of the structures. So whatever I make, imagine that there's going to be a mirror image on the other side. So suppose this is the midline. There's going to be a mirror image on the other side. Both hemispheres have the same structures. So let's say this is the thalamus with its divisions. This is the lentiform nucleus. Now the lentiform nucleus is divided into two parts. Outer part is called the putamen and the inside is called the globus pallidus, and this is further divided into two parts, internal part and external part. So this would be the internal part, this would be the external part. Alright, just going to erase those. And then the caudate nucleus head is somewhere here. On section you'll only see a head, otherwise there's a whole nucleus with a head, a body, and a tail, and at the end of the tail is the amygdala. But for now, I'm just drawing the section because I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. So, for the direct pathway, alright, I forgot a couple things. Here is going to be the subthalamus, and here is the substantia nigra. And it has two parts as well. This upper part is the pars compacta, and this lower part is the pars reticularis. So we're going to start from here. Now the direct pathway basically does not involve the subthalamus. It stays up here. That's why it's called the direct pathway, because it's easier and it's direct. So the first neuron, I'm going to start from here. The motor cortex is going to send signals down to the striatum. So functionally the caudate and the putamen are connected, and these fibers that come to the striatum. So I'm just putting them in the putamen because I have more space here, but they come to the striatum. So the input is the striatum, the neostriatum, which is the caudate nucleus and the putamen of the lentiform. And if you were to say corpus striatum, then that includes the globus pallidus as well. So from here fibers go to the internal part of the globus pallidus. Now you may notice I made this with a solid line and this with a dotted line, and the reason is that I'm making these solid line neurons because these are stimulatory neurons and these are inhibitory. So these release the neurotransmitter glutamate at the end, and these will release GABA. Now from here we have one more GABA releasing neuron going to the thalamus, and then from here a glutaminergic neuron going back up to the motor cortex, and then this is going out to the spinal cord and eventually to the muscles. So this is the direct pathway. The indirect pathway starts off the same, but this time the inhibitory neuron stops at the external part and it takes a detour down to the subthalamus. From here an excitatory neuron comes back up to the internal part of the globus pallidus, and from here another inhibitory neuron goes to the thalamus, and from here it's the same as the direct pathway. Now because of this little detour, the function kind of changes. So for example, if this neuron fires, this neuron will be stimulated and this will release GABA here. If this releases GABA, this will be inhibited. If this is inhibited, it won't release GABA here. If it doesn't release GABA here, this will fire. And if this fires, and the muscles will contract. So these are going to be the agonistic muscles of the action that you want to perform. So for example, if you want flexion at the elbow, then the biceps will contract. Now in the indirect pathway, for example, when this fires, this will stimulate this neuron and this will release GABA. If this releases GABA, this will be inhibited. If this is inhibited, then it won't release GABA here, so this will fire. If this fires, then this will be stimulated and this will release GABA, and so this will be inhibited, and hence this will be inhibited as well because this won't stimulate it. So these go to the antagonistic muscles. So essentially, when you decide to do an action, what the basal ganglia does is that it stimulates the agonistic muscles via the direct pathway and it inhibits the antagonistic muscles via the indirect pathway. So that's it for the direct and indirect pathway, but you may have noticed that I've left out the substantia nigra here. What happens is basically that the pars compacta has dopaminergic neurons that come to the putamen. And now they have different actions on these fibers and on these fibers. So when these dopaminergic neurons interact with the direct pathway, they stimulate it. Now if you notice that this glutaminergic neuron here was doing the same thing, stimulate, stimulate. So this will end up further causing the contraction. So it's kind of like it jump starts the action. But when it comes to the indirect pathway, then these dopaminergic neurons will not stimulate it. They will inhibit it. So over here, it's going to be inhibitory. This action is going to be stimulatory and this action is going to be inhibitory. Notice that it's the opposite of what this glutaminergic neuron here is doing. So when it would go through the indirect pathway from here, it would end up relaxing the antagonistic muscle. But what this is going to do is going to end up contracting the antagonistic muscle. So basically these dopaminergic neurons, their action is to contract both the agonistic and the antagonistic muscles. Now why is this important? Because this is what helps with fine-tuning the movements. Now you may have noticed that why there's a difference. The difference is because over here there's D1 receptors and here there's D2 receptors. So when the dopaminergic neuron comes to the D1 receptors, it will stimulate them, and when it comes to D2 receptors, it will inhibit the next neuron.